And also thank you to those fantastic talks. There's so much to unpick there, so I'm excited for the discussion element of this seminar. So yeah, as Imogen mentions, I'm Lucy. I'm a collaborative PhD student and I am based at the University of Sheffield and the Chatsworth House Trust in the UK. So for anyone who's not familiar with Chatsworth, here's a nice little illustration of it on this slide. It is a quite large and very popular heritage site and country house in Derbyshire. And it's about 15 minutes from Sheffield, so it's up in the north of England. So at Chatsworth, I look at the history of the archive, first and foremost, and secondarily, at the history of archival practices in the British country house. So within this, I'm really interested in the gendered and classed elements of record keeping at Chatsworth and across the wider estate community. So although to a large extent, Chatsworth's archive is this documentary record of the Earls and Dukes of Devonshire, and by extension, other members of the landowning family who've lived at Chatsworth. The archive is also a remarkably rich resource for understanding the lives and the memory practices of estate workers and residents across the class spectrum. And within this, I focus particularly on women and also on working class people. And so in doing this work, I'm trying to decenter the importance and prominence of the landowning family and of patrilineal inheritance and aristocratic genealogies. So I am trying to understand the country house as something a little more wider, something plural. For many people, I know that country houses represent this physical manifestation of immense power and privilege, but I'm trying to demonstrate that there is a lot more to the country house. It's actually the history of a whole community. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I thought I'd spend a bit of time unpicking some aspects of my own experience of being an embedded researcher working within a private family archive. Next slide, please. Okay, so I thought I would start by reflecting on notions of access and use as they relate to private family archives, particularly in the country house. So as a collaborative doctoral research, I've been embedded at Chatsworth in the wider collections department for the last 3 years or so. And as such, I have been given almost unfettered access to the Devonshire collection archives. So this access isn't freely given to everybody. Often if you come in as an external researcher, you'll need to show identity documents, for example. And it certainly wasn't entrusted to me lightly either. But of course, my own institutional affiliation and the partnership that my PhD constitutes affords me some legitimacy as a researcher. And in that way, I am afforded some trust. So this brings me on to my first sort of point, I suppose. We have negotiated this relationship during my PhD, which means that while I offer a new critical perspective on the country house archive and the family's history, I don't just have free license to simply use everything that I find, nor can I, or would I, go off and write some scathing critique of my research site, because this would obviously breach all notions of trust and also of ethical research. So my research entails continuously negotiating these particular sensitivities and managing the expectations and desires of the living people to whom the Chatsworth archive relates. So, for instance, there is a cut-off point for my research scope, which means that generally, with some exceptions, I don't tend to draw on archival records that are more recent than 1950. And this is partly a recognition of the fact that my research subjects aren't inert, obscure historical entities, but often they're actual real people with living descendants who are understandably hesitant, if not overtly protective, of their relatives' memories and their legacies. So working with private archives necessitates continuously checking in and reassessing the boundaries and limitations of all stakeholders. And having said this, obviously, I also have to hold the idea that not everyone will always be happy about what comes out of my research. So I can't necessarily allow my work to constantly run through layers of filters and censorship. It kind of has to take shape on its own sometimes. Beyond that, though, I think that for me, the concept of access in relation to private estate archives raises some really interesting questions about the purpose, the scope, and the remit of such repositories. So, for example, What motivates a private collection or private family archive to open itself up to external researchers like me? And secondly, speaking specifically of private estate archives like Chatsworth, do they have any kind of civic duty or responsibility to make themselves accessible to the public? Next slide, please. So I come back to this question of motivation quite a lot in my own thinking, and having heard Emma and Laura's talks today, I'd be really interested to know what they had to say on why families choose to work with external researchers. I often think about what is to be gained from these kind of interactions. And I would actually conclude that there's a lot to be gained. So first and foremost, they get detailed, focused historical research on their families and legacies. And we know that this can, of course, surface some uncomfortable truths and volatile, even reactionary responses. But beyond that, I would say that there is so much more to be gained from getting to know the nuances and textures of your family's history and its place in the wider social and cultural landscape. And that's both historically speaking and in terms of its relevance and position today. So an example from my own research at Chatsworth would be the women's histories that I've encountered and then traced. So although Chatsworth has this very storied history in the UK and it's very renowned as a heritage site, a lot of its touristic appeal and the historical scholarship around Chatsworth tends to hinge on the men who've inherited the family's peerage title. Of course, there are a few exceptions for duchesses, but by and large, a lot of women are forgotten. What my research has found is that often many women, either in the immediate family, also extended family relatives, and even middle or working class women who work their way into positions of power in the estate hierarchy, have often been the managers and administrators of the estate in all but name. So a couple of specific examples here on this slide. On the left, we have this woman, Lady Louisa Egerton, who was the daughter of the 7th Duke of Devonshire. You won't find Lady Louisa mentioned in any histories of Chatsworth or of the Devonshire collections, save for maybe a footnote. But she was largely responsible for opening up the library and the archive to external researchers, and also for formalising and trying to professionalise collections care. And then related to this, on the right, we have another one of my research interests. So this lady is called Eugenie Sellar-Strong. And from 1904 onwards, she was the first female librarian to the Duke of Devonshire. And this was a remarkably kind of groundbreaking position for a woman to hold at this time, certainly over a private collection with the immense kind of importance as Chatsworth's. So when I started this project, little was really known about these women or about their kind of seminal influence in making Chatsworth an outward-looking research repository. And it was really only when my project came along that we had time and the resources to do that exploratory research. So following on from this, I would venture that engendering access in this way also shores up the continued social relevance of historic houses and landed estates in the present. And we see this in some of the groundbreaking campaigns spearheaded by the likes of the National Trust, English Heritage and others, who are doing the work to establish more diverse histories or counter histories of such spaces. In turn, these campaigns recognise something important about these places. Whether privately or publicly owned, they bear the marks and traces of more than just one family's history. As sites of employment, residence and sociability spanning hundreds of years, estates like Chatsworth also represent the histories of the whole communities of which they're just one part. Their archives aren't only the historical record of a single landowning family, but also of the countless individuals, families and communities whose lives and histories are also entangled in their making. Next slide, please. So finally, this brings me back to the other question I asked earlier during this presentation. Do private archives have any kind of civic responsibility to make themselves accessible and accountable to a wider community in which they exist? From a purely technical standpoint, Chatsworth isn't a public body or service, so it comprises a charitable trust, an educational trust, and a private household. So this means that it definitely isn't obligated to throw open its archives to anyone but its board of trustees and the odd financial auditor. But having worked so intimately with this archive, I think that the idea of Chatsworth as representative of more than just the landowning family as holding something of the histories of those who variously lived and worked there means that it does surely bear some degree of civic responsibility to make those people's archival traces and their stories more visible and accessible. So as well as the Cavendish family archives and the records of estate management in the archives at Chatsworth, we also hold a growing collection of personal archives, and these are mainly donated by former workers or servants or their relatives or friends. So several of these donations have become a centerpiece of my thesis, and I thought I would draw one out here, which is a particular favourite of mine. So what you can see on this slide are fragments of a collection known as the Grafton Papers. And this is a collection of scrapbooks and postcard albums. It was assembled by members of 3 different local families over a 70-year period. And then each kind of person who'd collect this stuff would then hand it on to the next person. So these scrapbooks are fascinating to me because they represent this shared archival practice, and it really transgresses familial and generational boundaries. And in being passed on from one family to the next, they also represent their own form of archival inheritance. So the fragments that have been meticulously saved and scrapbooked here represent a powerful record of the wider estate community's social history and of the social bonds between various local people in the late 19th into the 20th century. So one thing that I've done, for example, is if you look at a lot of the postcards, there are about 600 or 700 postcards in total, you can actually transcribe and then find the kind of uncover the kind of social connections between different recipients and senders, which aren't immediately obvious in, say, like employment records or things that come through an official lens. So because the Grafton Papers comprise material that we would consider to be ephemeral, so postcards, press cuttings, photographic prints, even bus tickets in there, they were for a long time considered to be sort of anomalous to the rest of the collection. So after they were donated in the mid-1990s, they lost a lot of the vital sort of contextual folds that tie them to particular people and give them meaning in the present. So they were catalogued only very minimally, and therefore they kind of became a hidden collection within the broader collection. And it's only through my own kind of deep research that some of this vital lost context has been recovered and reinstated in the catalogue entries, and so that they can become, again, more useful and accessible to researchers and, more importantly, to the local community, which they document. Going forward with the Grafton Papers, it's my pipe dream to be able to trace some of the descendants of the Graftons, who were the last family to put together this collection. So hopefully that's a post-PhD project, we shall see. But returning to, I suppose, the question that I brought to the table here, does a private family archive bear any obligation to make itself publicly accessible? Now, this is obviously very contingent on specific context, but as far as the Country House Archive is concerned, I would argue that yes, it does, because these collections aren't the records of one single family. Rather, they very often hold the stories of other families and of the local community as well. So I think I'm probably over 10 minutes, so I will leave it there. But I hope you've enjoyed some of my kind of nascent thoughts and ramblings on this, and I'm really looking forward to engaging with your reflections and your questions. Thank you so much for listening.